Hello, BigSurv20 viewers. I am Arnold Lau, a research analyst with Pew Research Center, and today I'd like to talk about some of our exploratory work on writerly respondents, explaining non-response and response length for open-ended questions. In online surveys, it's well known that open-ended questions have lower response rates than closed-ended questions. The literature has also established that factors such as education and device type contribute to open-ended non-response. In this study, I take an additional look at whether not just non-response but also response length are affected by similar factors. After all, when coding open-ended responses, then you can't do anything about people who didn't respond. However, longer responses could have an outsized influence in coding, whether manually or through unsupervised learning approaches such as topic modeling. For example, when center researchers previously coded responses to a prompt asking people what they found meaningful in their lives, certain codes or topics only came up among people who wrote longer responses in general. For instance, a lot of people would mention family, but only those who were inclined to write longer responses brought up secondary topics such as their pets. Response length can thus be an additional source of bias. I also simultaneously look at the role of question-level characteristics, which I will discuss later. And finally, I want to take a first pass at sussing out which of these factors were more important, that is to say, had more noticeable differences between groups than others. For example, device type could end up dwarfing everything else, and that's harder to adjust for than just demographic characteristics. For this study, I used data from Pew's American Trends panel from 2017 to 2020. Looking at a total of 161 open-ended questions across 46 waves. Using panel data has several advantages here, such as being able to observe characteristics that change over time, for example, device type, being able to look at response behavior across multiple surveys while controlling for how long they've been in the panel, and being able to look at a wide variety of open-ended questions that center researchers have put on surveys throughout the years. To give a brief overview of our American Trends Panel, or ATP, it is a national probability-based sample of adults who take online surveys for us. We used to recruit them through the phone, RDD, but nowadays we recruit them through address-based sampling. As I said, it's 100% online. Households without internet are provided tablets and a data plan. We conduct about 1 to 2 surveys per month, either 8 or 15 minutes long. We've had the panel for around 6 years. And we give incentives around $5 to $20 for each survey depending on respondent characteristics. And the ATP is the Pew Research Center's primary platform for domestic data collection. So we have two things that are being predicted: an indicator for response, and among those who responded, the number of tokens in each response, which you can basically think of as the number of words. This does include filler words such as stop words and the like. Predictors include respondent-level characteristics such as education, gender, age, race and ethnicity, party and ideological affiliation, volunteerism, and recruitment cohort. Then we have question-level characteristics: the topic of the question, the expected verbosity, and whether or not a refusal counts as a substantive answer. I'll give examples of what I mean by these features in the next slide. Finally, we have device type, which is a respondent characteristic that varies by wave. About half of our panelists have used more than one type of device across multiple waves. First off, the topic of question, what a question is about. Obviously, this in itself is pretty subjective, but I get at a more or less consistent measure of this by using, as a proxy, which team within the center fielded the question. So, the Pew Research Center is divided into multiple substantive areas of interest, and an individual panel wave is either entirely fielded by one team or made up of distinct segments containing one team's content and then another team's content. So, in short, if it's a question fielded and reported on by our politics team, I classify that as a politics question, and so on and so forth, resulting in 6 topics: politics, society, journalism, religion, science, technology, and the internet, as well as feedback questions, which are their own thing entirely. The expected verbosity of a question is just whether the wording of the question is expecting a longer or shorter answer. For example, we ask people who their choice would be for the Democratic nominee, and we're just expecting people to provide names. But if we ask something like, what's the most important factor? Some people could give short answers while others could write entire paragraphs. And so this is basically just a two-category predictor, longer or shorter answer. Then we have another binary indicator for whether non-response counts as a substantive answer or not. These are questions where non-response is akin to a panelist saying no. In the examples I give below, in the question about President Trump, the if anything indicates that the respondent skipping the question is the equivalent of their saying, nothing concerns me. Similarly, nobody might come to mind for a respondent regarding Catholicism, but we would treat non-response there as basically saying, well, I don't have an answer for this question, but we wouldn't treat it the same way as an outright refusal to answer. And these are just some examples of the questions that got classified under various topics. For journalism, we have questions such as, what do you like or dislike most about getting news on social media? Or, what important news stories do you feel the news media ignores? Questions that ask people about specific news stories or about how they feel about news. For society, which is one of the most general topics, we have questions such as, what do you think can be done to improve Americans' confidence in each other? Or, in your own words, what is a lesson or set of lessons that humankind should learn from the coronavirus outbreak? Under science, technology, and internet, we have questions about digital privacy or questions about science as a whole and its effect on society. Politics is self-explanatory. Why would you be more likely to share or avoid sharing your own views about Donald Trump? What's the main reason you voted, etc.? So is religion. We have questions such as, in your own words, what is the most important way in which Catholics and Protestants today are religiously similar? Or as far as you know, what does the Holocaust refer to? And as I said before, we have a separate topic for feedback, and our feedback question is worded this way. If you have any feedback about the survey, please use the box below. I set up separate regression models for our two outcomes of interest. A logistic regression for whether or not a panelist responded, and a negative binomial regression for the number of tokens in each response. Alongside the previously discussed predictors, which entered the model as fixed effects, I set random effects or varying intercepts across individual respondents and on individual questions, so essentially a cross-classified model. I estimated this model with the R package BRMS, which is for Bayesian inference, with default uninformative priors, because while I have guesses about which factors might predict more non-response or longer responses, I don't have any intuition about the magnitude of those effects. In the following graphs, I present the results as predictions on existing data after removing random effects. First off are our standard demographics. As can be seen, there are actually differences in the kinds of bias you might get when you consider non-response alone versus also considering which people write longer responses. Older people and men tend to respond more. But as for response length, while we see the older age group with longer responses, differences between younger age groups aren't as pronounced, and there's almost no difference in gender. Now, I'd like to direct your attention to the lower right corner of each graph. Race and ethnicity appear not to be a huge issue for non-response, but among those who do opt to write something, there is a very stark difference between whites and non-whites, especially black people, in how much they write. Meanwhile, education affects both non-response and response length, the latter with pretty large differences. So by the time you get to coding your open-ends, you run the risk of just doubling down your college-educated respondents. Then while not shown here, voluntarism also affects both non-response and response length, but in pretty modest ways. Next up is device type. I actually found these results pretty surprising. While we would expect, as we can see on the right, that people answering surveys on tablets or smartphones write shorter responses than people on a laptop or desktop, there was virtually no difference between laptop or PC users and tablet users as far as the decision to respond to an open-end was concerned. It's really only smartphones that predict both non-response and shorter response length. This suggests that lumping smartphones and tablet devices together under the umbrella term of mobile devices might not be that useful, depending on the circumstances. Now we move on to partisanship and the political spectrum. Straight self-reported partisanship actually contributes almost nothing to predicting either non-response or response length, after adjusting for everything else in the model. By contrast, people who describe themselves as moderates are noticeably less likely to respond, and less likely to respond at length. Put another way, your open-end responses are going to consist more of people at each end of the political spectrum, and this is true in general, not just for questions that are explicitly about politics. Now we're taking a look at the question level characteristics. It doesn't come as a surprise that people are less likely to respond to a question that they sense is asking more of them. And that difference widens for questions, as we can see on the left, in which non-response could be a very concrete answer. Classifying questions as allowing or not allowing substantive refusal, however, does not at all predict response length, as can be seen on the right, where the estimated number of tokens is pretty much the same on the top and bottom graphs. Of course, the wide gap between short answer type questions and long form questions in the number of tokens is to be expected by definition. Finally, a look at question topic. The obvious outlier here are the feedback questions, because those just work completely differently. I will note that the few people who do provide feedback tend to be quite verbose about it. The less obvious outlier here is journalism. Questions about the news media are predicted to get 20 to 30 percentage points less response than any other topic, be it religion, politics, science, technology and the internet, or society. There are several possible reasons why this could be the case, the most likely to me being that asking people to recall and provide specific news stories is a very high difficulty task. Or perhaps people just don't think about the news media in particular a lot. Journalism is not noticeably different from most of the other topics as far as response length is concerned, with religion being the bigger outlier. Though response length differences by topic are less of a concern for open-end coding, as you'd usually be coding responses within a specific question anyway. So, what are the key takeaways from this exploratory study? First off, different factors affect who responds to an open-ended question versus how much they write. For example, as we saw, education affects both, but race and ethnicity only correlates with response length, while gender only correlates with response propensity. Second, smartphones and tablets shouldn't be lumped together. Tablet users in particular are just as likely as desktop or laptop users to opt to respond to an open-ended question. Thirdly, open-ended responses as a whole are also somewhat biased away from political moderates. You're more likely to get responses from people who identify at the further ends of the political spectrum. And finally, certain topics, such as journalism, can greatly lower response rates across the board. Now I have to mention that topic here is a proxy measure for center team, so there are several possible confounding factors as to the difference in response rates. But still, it is a very stark difference. Further work I hope to do on this study would be to refine question level characteristics. I think there are a whole bunch of possible ways of characterizing questions that I haven't really touched on yet. I could also look at interactions between variables such as education by race or ethnicity, although I should say that the models were difficult enough to fit as is. Get more data. The American Trends panel is still ongoing, and the more waves we have, the richer insights we can get, and we can also try predicting on new data, new panelists, new questions. And finally, I could investigate types as well as tokens, types being unique words. I had initially wanted to look at the type-token ratio, but in the end, you need really long documents for the type-token ratio to make any kind of sense. And that is all for my presentation. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and suggestions.